In the spring of 1988, a journalist named Bose Hadley sat down with Van Johnson in a restaurant in New York and asked him a question that nobody in the American entertainment press had asked him directly in 40 years of interviews. The question was simple. The answer took 30 seconds. And in those 30 seconds, Van Johnson said something that dismantled, quietly and without ceremony, one of the most carefully constructed fictions that Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer had produced in the entire history of a studio that had spent 3 decades producing fictions about the people who worked for it. He confirmed what the people who had known him since the 1940s had known, and what the people who had observed the specific architecture of his personal life had understood, and what a generation of gay men who had watched him on screen had intuited with the particular precision of people who are practiced at reading the thing that is present but not spoken. He confirmed that the cheerful, freckle-faced, all-American boy next door, who had been one of the most popular stars in the world in the years immediately following the Second World War, had been, for the entirety of that popularity, and for the 30 years that followed its decline, a gay man living in a country and an industry that would have destroyed him if it had known. He said it carefully, in the way of a man who has been careful for 30 years and has not entirely stopped being careful even now, even at the age of 62, even in the specific context of a journalist who is asking the question directly and expecting a direct answer. He said it in the way of a man who understands that saying a thing after 30 years of not saying it does not feel like release, so much as it feels like the removal of a weight so familiar that the removal itself is disorienting. He said it, and Bose Hadley recorded it, and it appeared in a book called Hollywood Gays in 1994, and the world largely did not notice, because by 1994, Van Johnson was a name from another era, and the world had other things to pay attention to. And the specific institutional architecture that had required him to carry the thing for 30 years was too far in the past to generate the outrage that it would have generated if it had been exposed at the time. Tonight, my friend, I want to tell you the story of those 30 years. Not the story that MGM told, though I will tell you that story too, because you cannot understand what was buried without understanding what was built in its place. The real story. The story of a gay man in Hollywood in the 1940s who was managed by the most powerful studio system in the world into a marriage he did not want and a public identity he did not choose, and who maintained that identity for 3 decades because the alternative was not an alternative at all. Come with me. We are going back to Newport, Rhode Island in the year 1916, to a family that was not particularly wealthy and not particularly connected to anything that would have predicted that the boy born in it would one day become one of the 50 most recognizable faces on Earth. Charles Van Johnson was born on the 28th of August, 1916, in Newport, Rhode Island. His father, Charles E. Johnson, was a Swedish-American man of steady, unremarkable employment who provided for his family in the way of men of his class and era, which is to say adequately and without excess. His mother, Loretta, was Irish-American, and she left the family when Van was 3 years old, in a departure that was not explained to him in terms a 3-year-old could process, and that was not fully explained to him in terms an adult could process for many years after that. He grew up largely without her. He grew up in a household defined by her absence, which is a particular kind of growing up that produces, in some people, a quality of almost compulsive need for approval and affection that the people who later loved him, the fans, above all, the fans of the 1940s, who sent him 30,000 letters a month at the peak of his popularity, recognized instinctively, because he gave it off like a frequency, the specific warmth of someone who has learned to present warmth, because warmth is the thing that keeps people from leaving. He was a dancer before he was an actor. in the sense that his earliest professional work was in Broadway choruses and musical revues, the bottom of the theatrical ladder in New York in the late 1930s. He was good at it. He had the physical quality that chorus work requires, which is not the individual expressiveness of a soloist, but the ability to be precisely where the choreography requires him to be, at precisely the moment it requires him to be there, which is a different and in some ways more demanding skill because it requires the subordination of individual impulse to collective precision. He learned it young, and he never lost it, and the quality of physical discipline it instilled was visible in his screen work for the next 4 decades. He was performing in a Broadway show called Pal Joey in 1940 when he was first noticed by someone with the ability to translate noticing into action. The someone was not an MGM scout, not yet. He was seen in New York by several people in the period between 1940 and 1942 who saw in the red hair and the freckles and the quality of open, uncalculating charm a face that the camera might want and whose wanting might be commercially useful. He arrived in Hollywood in 1942. He was 25 years old. He had a screen test at MGM, and the screen test produced the response that screen tests from this era either produced or did not produce, which was the recognition by the people watching it that what was in front of the camera was something the camera was going to find useful. The face was extraordinary in a specific and unusual way. Not conventionally handsome in the chiseled manner of the studio's established male stars, but alive in a way that the camera responded to differently, with an openness of expression and a quality of apparent emotional accessibility that translated through the lens into the feeling that the person on screen was present in a way that was not always true of people whose beauty was more formal. He was signed. He was given small roles in a series of MGM productions in 1942 and early 1943, the kind of roles that studios give to contract players they have not yet decided what to do with, and he acquitted himself in them with the professional efficiency of a man who has spent years in chorus work and understands the discipline of giving a production what it needs without requiring the production to give you more than it has decided to give. And then, in March of 1943, he was in a car accident. The accident was serious. He was a passenger in a vehicle that was involved in a collision, and the injuries he sustained included a significant head injury that left a metal plate in his skull, and that required a long recovery period at a time when his career was at the very beginning of the trajectory that would make him one of the most famous men in the world. He was hospitalized. He was in physical danger for a period that was genuine rather than managed. The head injury was the kind that required careful attention and that had, in the assessment of the physicians treating him, the potential for consequences that were not entirely predictable. He recovered. But the recovery took months, and the months meant that he was not available for the military draft that was taking the majority of his male contemporaries away from Hollywood and into uniform. The metal plate in his skull made him 4F, medically unfit for military service, at a time when the absence of young men from Hollywood was creating, at the box office, a vacuum that the studios were trying to fill with whoever was available and who could be made to look right in the specific configuration of wartime romantic hero that the audience required. Van Johnson was available. Van Johnson had the face. Van Johnson had the quality of accessible, unthreatening appeal that women whose husbands and boyfriends and brothers were overseas tended to find in the specific kind of screen presence that does not challenge or disturb, but simply offers warmth and the particular comfort of a face that seems to be on your side. The timing was, in retrospect, the defining commercial fact of his career. He became, in 1943 and 1944, exactly what the wartime MGM audience needed him to be, in a way that would have been impossible if the accident had not happened and the draft had claimed him along with everyone else. He appeared in A Guy Named Joe in 1943, a fantasy film about a dead pilot who guides the career of a younger flyer, and he appeared alongside Spencer Tracy, and the film was one of the most commercially successful productions of the year. And the mail started arriving at the studio in quantities that alarmed the mailroom staff and delighted the marketing department. 30,000 letters a month. That is the figure that the studio's own records documented for the peak period of his popularity in 1944 and 1945. 30,000 letters, overwhelmingly from women, overwhelmingly expressing the specific combination of romantic attachment and protective warmth that the wartime audience had decided Van Johnson uniquely represented. He was the boy next door who had stayed home. He was the face that the women of America were writing to while their men were somewhere they could not be reached. He was also, and the people at MGM who were making decisions about his career understood this, a gay man in a studio system that would have considered that fact, if it had been publicly known, to be a commercial liability of catastrophic proportions. I want to be precise about what I mean by understood, because the word is doing significant work in that sentence, and it deserves to be used accurately. What is documented from the accounts that emerged in the years after Van Johnson began speaking more openly, and from the accounts of people who worked at MGM during the period, is that the awareness of Van Johnson's sexuality within the studio's management structure was not incidental or ambiguous. It was concrete and specific, and it was acted upon. The acting upon is the part that distinguishes this story from the general story of closeted gay men in Hollywood, which was common enough to be almost unremarkable in the studio system of the 1940s. What distinguishes Van Johnson's story is the specific nature of the institution's intervention in his private life. The person at the center of that intervention was Keenan Wynn. Keenan Wynn was a character actor at MGM, the son of the comedian Ed Wynn, a man of genuine talent who spent his career in the specific professional category that Hollywood labels a supporting actor, which is the category of people whose contributions to a film are often essential and who are almost never the reason the audience buys a ticket. He and Van Johnson had been close friends since Johnson's arrival in Hollywood. They were roommates for a period. By multiple accounts from the period, they were genuinely devoted to each other in the way of people who have found in a specific friendship the specific quality of understanding that is not available to them elsewhere. Keenan Wynn was married. His wife was Evie Abbott Wynn, a woman who had been, in her own account and in the accounts of the people who knew her, genuinely unhappy in the marriage for reasons that she described in later years with a directness that was characteristic of her. She was unhappy, and MGM was aware that she was unhappy, and the studio's awareness of her unhappiness converged in 1947 with the studio's awareness of Van Johnson's sexuality. And the convergence produced an outcome that the people who arranged it considered a solution, and that the people most directly affected by it had various other names for. Louis B. Mayer was the head of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. This is a fact that requires almost no elaboration for anyone with even a passing acquaintance with Hollywood history. Mayer was one of the most powerful individuals in the entertainment industry, a man who exercised over the careers and the personal lives of the people who worked for his studio, a degree of control that was absolute, in the sense that it was not subject to appeal and not constrained by any mechanism outside the studio's own institutional hierarchy. He was not a man who made suggestions to his contract players. He was a man who made decisions, and the distinction between suggesting and deciding was not one that the people who received his communications were generally confused about. Mayer called Van Johnson into his office in 1947. What was said in that office is not documented in a form that I can present to you as a direct quotation, because office conversations between studio heads and their contract players in 1947 did not produce transcripts. What is documented from multiple independent accounts that emerged over the following decades, including Van Johnson's own, is the substance of what was communicated. Meyer communicated that he was aware of the nature of Van Johnson's private life. He communicated that the nature of that private life was incompatible with the commercial interests of the studio that was paying Van Johnson's salary and managing his career. He communicated that the studio had identified a solution to this incompatibility. The solution was this: Van Johnson would marry Evie Abbott Wynne. Keenan Wynne would cooperate with this arrangement by divorcing Evie and relinquishing his claim to the marriage, and in exchange for this cooperation, he would continue to work at MGM. Van Johnson would take Evie as his wife, and in exchange for this arrangement, he would continue to be the most popular male star in the studio's current stable, and the 30,000 letters a month would continue to arrive, and the career would continue. And the alternative, which was the discovery by the American public of what Meyer already knew, would not occur. This is the arrangement that was made. I want to be clear about what kind of arrangement it was, because the language we use for things shapes the way we understand them, and I do not want to use language that softens the reality of what happened. Meyer told Van Johnson that he would marry a woman he did not love or desire, that he would present to the American public a marriage that was a fabrication, and that he would do this because the alternative was the destruction of everything his career had produced. And he told Keenan Wynne that he would cooperate with this arrangement and divorce his wife because his continued employment at the studio was contingent on his cooperation. Van Johnson married Evie Abbott Wynne in January of 1947. The marriage was covered by the fan magazines and the entertainment press with the specific warmth that the press extended to the marriages of beloved stars. Photographs of the happy couple, descriptions of the ceremony, the particular confected warmth of coverage that the studio's publicity apparatus produced for domestic arrangements it needed the public to believe in. The public believed in it. The 30,000 letters continued to arrive, now with an additional note of warmth for the wholesome domesticity of America's favorite freckled film star, settled at last with a lovely wife. They had a daughter together, Skylar, born in 1948. The existence of a child complicates the story in the way that children always complicate these stories, because a child is not a prop in a studio publicity arrangement, but an actual human being who will grow up in the circumstances her parents have created, and who will form her own understanding of those circumstances over the years of her childhood, and who will carry that understanding in the specific way that children carry the understanding of what their parents' relationship actually was. Skylar has spoken about her parents' marriage over the years in the careful way of someone who loves both parents and is trying to be honest about something complicated without being destructive about it. She has spoken about a household that was, in her memory, not marked by the specific quality of happiness that the fan magazine coverage of her parents had suggested. She has spoken about a marriage that was functional and occasionally warm, and that lacked, in the specific quality of its domestic atmosphere, the particular thing that distinguishes a marriage built on genuine mutual desire from a marriage built on institutional convenience. She has said that her parents cared for each other in the way of people who have been through something significant together. She has not said that they were in love, because the evidence did not support that description, and she is too honest to produce evidence that does not exist. Van Johnson and Evie Wynne divorced in 1968, 21 years after the wedding that MGM had arranged. 21 years of the marriage that Meyer had designed and enforced, and that the public had been invited to admire. 21 years of the 30,000 letters arriving, the fan mail from women who had understood Van Johnson's apparent warmth and open accessibility as the warmth and accessibility of a man who was available to be loved in the way they needed him to be loved, which is to say, a man who was heterosexual and domestic and devoted to a good woman, which is what they had been told he was, which is what he was not. The career had already begun to decline by 1968. in the way that careers built on a specific quality of youthful appeal tend to decline when the youth is no longer available to generate the appeal. He had made good films in the 1950s. The Caine Mutiny in 1954, in which he played the role of Lieutenant Steve Merrick opposite Humphrey Bogart's Captain Queeg, and which required of him a quality of moral seriousness that the wartime audience had not necessarily expected, and which he delivered with the careful professionalism that had always been the foundation of his work when the material gave him something real to work with. He had continued to work in the 1960s, in a diminished range of productions that reflected the industry's assessment of where his commercial value now sat, which was lower than it had been and declining rather than stable. The divorce, when it came, was handled with the same careful management of public information that had characterized the marriage. The parties were cordial. The daughter was well provided for. The statements were brief and dignified. And the American public, which had mostly moved on to other things, received the news of the dissolution of Van Johnson's marriage with a fraction of the attention it had received the news of its creation 21 years earlier. He moved to New York after the divorce. He found in New York, in the late 1960s, a city that was in the process of changing in ways that were significant to him specifically, in ways that the city he had left when he came to Hollywood in 1942 had not yet offered. He found, in the specific geography and social world of New York in the years between the Stonewall Uprising of 1969 and the catastrophe of the AIDS epidemic in the early 1980s, a version of life that was more available to him than anything he had been able to access in the MGM years. He did not speak publicly about this. Not in 1969, and not in 1975, and not in 1980. He continued to work in the diminishing professional world of a man whose peak commercial appeal was 20 years in the past. Television movies, stage work, the specific circuit of theatrical productions in smaller markets that sustains careers after Hollywood has finished with them. He was professional in all of it, and he was good in much of it. And he did not complain about the arc of the career in the way that people who are not professionally realistic tend to complain. What he was doing in those years was carrying the thing. The specific weight of the thing, which is not the weight of a single secret, but the weight of 30 years of accumulated consequence. The marriage he had not wanted, the public identity he had not chosen, the 30,000 letters from women who had believed in a version of him that the studio had constructed and that he had been required to inhabit. He was carrying the knowledge that his career, the entire commercial edifice of Van Johnson, the wartime sweetheart, Van Johnson, the all-American boy next door, Van Johnson, the beloved freckled face of post-war Hollywood domesticity, had been built on an institutional lie that he had been compelled to maintain for 30 years. The weight of that kind of thing is not the weight of guilt in the straightforward sense. He had not done something wrong in a moral sense that requires guilt. He had been a young man with a specific sexual orientation, existing in a specific institutional context, given by the most powerful person in that context a specific choice, a choice between complying with the institution's requirements and losing everything the institution controlled, which was everything. And he had made the choice that the situation made for him in the way that choices made under duress are made, which is to say, not really by him at all, but by the circumstances that the institution had created. The weight was something different from guilt. It was the weight of a life in which the most fundamental thing about you, the thing that determines who you are able to love, and how you are able to love them, and what the daily experience of your own existence feels like, had been required, by institutional decree, to be invisible, to be not only unspoken, but actively counteracted, presented to the world in the form of its opposite, maintained in that counteracted form for 21 years of a marriage and 30 years of a public identity, at the cost of whatever the maintenance cost. which was not a cost that anyone who had not paid it could accurately calculate. Evie Wynn died in 1981. She had been, by all accounts, a more complicated figure than the studio's presentation of her as Van Johnson's wholesome wife had suggested, a woman of intelligence and social acuity who had entered the arrangement with her own understanding of what it was and had navigated it with the specific competence of a woman who has been placed in an unusual situation by powerful people, and who has decided that survival requires adaptation rather than resistance. Her relationship with Van Johnson in the years after the divorce was reported by people who observed them as warmer than might have been expected. The specific warmth of two people who have been through something significant together and who have each arrived at a version of forgiveness that does not require the complete reconstruction of the past. Keenan Wynn died in 1986. He had continued to work throughout the decades after the divorce that Meyer had required of him, in the way of a character actor who is reliable and skilled and therefore never entirely without employment, even when the specific productions available to him are not the productions he might have chosen. Whether he had, over the 40 years between the divorce and his death, developed a relationship with the events of 1947 that resembled anything other than the practical acceptance of what could not be changed, is something the available accounts do not fully illuminate. He spoke about Van Johnson occasionally, in the interviews of his later career, in terms that were fond rather than resentful, which may mean various things, and which I will not pretend to interpret more confidently than the evidence allows. Louis B. Mayer had been forced out of MGM in 1951, in the specific way that powerful men who have built institutional empires are sometimes forced out of them, by a combination of commercial failure, internal politics, and the gradual erosion of the absolute authority that had made the empire possible. He died in 1957. He died having built one of the most successful entertainment enterprises in the history of American commercial culture, and having managed the personal lives of the people who worked for him with a degree of control that is difficult, from the distance of the present, to fully comprehend, and that was not, during the period of his authority, meaningfully resisted by anyone with enough institutional power to make resistance effective. In 1988, Bose Hadley sat down with Van Johnson in a restaurant in New York. Van Johnson was 62 years old. He had been carrying the thing for 40 years. He had been carrying the specific weight of the MGM arrangement since 1947, and he had been carrying the more general weight of his sexual orientation in a culture that criminalized and pathologized and commercially destroyed it since before that. He had carried it through the wartime popularity, and through the post-war decline, and through 21 years of the marriage Mayer had designed, and through the New York years, and through the continuing professional life of a man whose peak was a long way behind him, and who was still, at 62, a professional in the complete sense. Hadley asked the question. Van Johnson answered it, he said, in the careful language of a man who has spent 40 years being careful, enough that the answer was an answer, and not the indefinite deflection that the question had been receiving for 40 years. The answer appeared in Hollywood Gaze in 1994. It did not produce the disruption that it would have produced in 1947. The cultural landscape of 1994 was not the cultural landscape of 1947, and the commercial apparatus that had required the secrecy no longer had the form it had had when the secrecy was required. And the man speaking was 68 years old, and the peak of his commercial significance was 50 years in the past, and the world had moved on in all the ways that the world moves on when 50 years have elapsed. The response to the disclosure was, in essence, the response of a culture to a piece of information that arrived too late to do much with. There was some coverage. There were some magazine pieces. There was the specific quality of posthumous reassessment that tends to attend disclosures of this kind, in which people who had known Van Johnson, or who had written about him, or who had been part of the industry during his peak years, said the things that people say when they are integrating a new piece of information into an established narrative. And then the world went back to what it had been doing, because it had other things to pay attention to. He continued to work. He appeared in stage productions in the 1990s in the specific circuit of theatrical work that sustains careers at his level. And he was good in them. And he was professional. And the people who worked with him described him in the terms that people use to describe colleagues who have been at their craft for 50 years and have arrived at the equanimity that comes from knowing what you are doing and no longer needing to prove it. He died on December the 12th, 2008, in Nyack, New York. He was 92 years old. He had outlived Mayer by 51 years and outlived the studio system that had required the arrangement by several decades, and he had spent the last 20 years of his life in a version of his own life that was more his own than the version the studio had designed, even if 20 years was not enough time to fully reclaim what 40 years of the other version had cost. The obituaries mentioned the wartime popularity. They mentioned the 30,000 letters a month. They mentioned the Caine Mutiny and a guy named Joe, and the specific quality of accessible charm that had made him, briefly, one of the most beloved faces in American cinema. Most of them mentioned, briefly, the 1994 disclosure, in the way that obituaries mention things that are documented and that have become part of the public record. None of them spent very much time on what the studio had required of him, because the studio was gone and the man was gone, and the people who had made the decision were gone. And what remained was a career and a life, and the specific shape that both had taken under the influence of an institutional decision made by a man with absolute authority over the people who worked for him. I want to sit with you now for a moment, my friend, in the space after this story, because I think what happened to Van Johnson was not unique in its specifics. The specific architecture of the MGM arrangement, the specific marriage, the specific intervention of Mayer, but it was unique in the degree to which those specifics are documented. In the way that Van Johnson's own eventual willingness to speak, combined with the accounts of people who had been present, allows the outline of what happened to be described with more confidence than is possible for the many similar stories that remain entirely unspoken. The studio system of classical Hollywood managed the sexuality of its gay contract players with a systematic efficiency that was the product not of any particular animus toward gay people, though the institutional culture of Hollywood was not notably free of that animus, but of the commercial logic that defined every other decision the studios made. Gay performers were commercially useful because audiences liked them and bought tickets to see them. Gay performers were commercially dangerous because audiences in the 1940s and 1950s had been told that their sexual orientation was criminal and pathological and incompatible with the image of wholesome American life that the studios sold. The solution to this commercial tension was the systematic erasure of the commercial danger, which meant the systematic management of the private lives of gay performers in the direction of public heterosexuality. The management took different forms with different performers. Some were managed through a general pressure toward discretion, toward the careful avoidance of the public behavior that would have made the information available. Some were managed through the cultivation of beards, women willing to be seen publicly with gay male performers in contexts that implied romantic connection, and some, of whom Van Johnson is among the most clearly documented examples, were managed through the institutional arrangement of actual marriages to women whose own circumstances made the arrangement workable. The people who made these decisions were not, most of them, monsters in the simple sense. They were people operating within an institutional logic that they had not created, and that they did not, for the most part, examine critically, because institutions of the kind that MGM represented in its heyday do not encourage the critical examination of their own premises. They were people who understood what the commercial requirements were, and who developed practices to meet those requirements, and who applied those practices to the people over whom they had authority with the efficient impersonality of institutional management everywhere. What they took from the people they managed was not something that appeared on any balance sheet, because it was not a thing that balance sheets measure. They took the ordinary human entitlement to live as one actually is, to love the people one actually loves, to construct one's public life in a relationship to one's private life that does not require the daily performance of a fundamental untruth. They took 30 years of Van Johnson's life and organized it around a commercial requirement that had nothing to do with who he was. They gave him back, in exchange, the career and the fame and the 30,000 letters and the specific consolation of being loved at enormous scale by people who were loving an image rather than a person. He took what was given. He gave what was required. He carried what could not be put down. And eventually, at 62 years old in a restaurant in New York, he put a small part of it down. It was enough to tell the truth. It was not enough to undo the 30 years. Nothing is enough to undo 30 years. The most that is possible, when 30 years have elapsed and the institutional machinery that required them has dissolved and the people who made the decisions are gone, is that the truth gets said. He said it. You have heard it. Sleep well, my friend. And the next time you see that face, the red hair, the freckles, the open expression that the camera found and translated into 30,000 letters a month, see what was behind it. See a man who gave the world the warmth he was permitted to give and kept, for as long as he had to keep it, the truth of who he was. MGM built the image. Van Johnson paid for it. For 30 years, he paid for it alone.